Right. So, hello everyone. I am very happy today because I get to speak to one of my little favorites, which is Lindsay Williams. And I saw you put out this call for anybody interested in talking to me. And I was like, of course, I'm always interested in talking to you. And I saw that on Twitter and responded straight away. And of course, you very kindly got back and said, yes, I'd like to talk to you too. So I felt good because then I thought, okay, I'm not going to be stuck. I'm fine. I'm okay, I'm still in the good books.
Very much a two-way thing.
Fantastic. And then obviously I was thinking, well, what would I like to specifically talk to you about? And there are so many things I could talk to you about because you've got so many things to share. But actually, you know what? I mean, you know, for me, and with the Polyglot Conference as well, one of my pet things is I love indigenous, endangered, and vulnerable languages. I'm a great proponent of learning these languages and supporting communities, and also because not just for the sake of like saving a language or for the sake of these people can't do it on their own. They can. They're very capable communities. It's nothing to do with that. It's actually super interesting to look at the world through a different version of history. Because sometimes we're taught, or most of the time actually, we're taught history through the eyes of the people who write it. And often that version is the one that's written in the sort of the more widely learnt and spoken world languages, like your Englishes or your Frenches or your Spanishes and everything in between. And I thought, what a great thing to do, because you've studied, and now let's get the name of it right and pronounce it properly, Guarani.
Yeah, I say Guarani.
Guarani.
Or sometimes I say Guarani, like depends on, it's a bit like Bath and Bath. Mm-hmm. I very much go sort of one or the other on that. Yeah.
So I could go like Guarani, like, you know.
Yeah, it works.
Guarani. I'm gonna do Guarani now.
Or we could call it Avanye.
Wow, Avanye.
Call it the Guarani name. Yeah.
Very nice. I like that. Yeah. I like that. Although,
and you were just saying about the history and the different kind of perspectives. So Avanye actually means nye, which is just one of the most amazing words because it's so fun to say. Two nasals, big glottal stop in the middle. It means language. Like of all the words to mean language, it's the most fun to say.
Say it again.
Nye.
Nye. I love it. I love it.
And then if you say ava in front of that, avanye, that means Guarani. And it just means like people's language, commoners' language, person's language.
Okay.
As opposed to karainye, which is Spanish, which means master's language, señor's language.
Oh, wow. That's really
interesting. Boom. Different perspective, number one.
I love that. And you know what? When you first said avanye, I actually thought, and I started saying, I'm going to forget that because, you know, it sounds so different to what you're used to, but the story you added to it and the fact that you mentioned the two nasal sounds, it really helps the word to stick. And this is definitely a cool, I mean, totally different conversation, but a really, really cool thing that you gave that anecdote as well. And you told me that bit of history. I love it. Yeah. And the master's language for Spanish. It's in yours language, as you say.
Very interesting, isn't it? Yeah. It's just so much just embodied in those two words already.
That's so loaded.
Yeah.
I mean, how did you get interested? I mean, you know, tell us a bit about yourself. I mean, everyone knows you and loves you already, but I'm sure, just in case there's somebody out there who doesn't, tell us a little bit about you, your language history, and so how you got into Guarani or Avanye.
There we go. So I started learning languages, primary school, went to French, primary school club, croissants, it was all lots of fun. Then started Spanish. I wanted to do Spanish at GCSE and my school said you have to keep doing French. So I ended up on this path where I was automatically kind of age 14 doing multiple languages without really thinking about it. And then just thought, oh, this is cool. I quite like this language thing. It's fun. The other thing I did was drama. And I always knew that as fun as all of that was, I was never going to be like an actress. Like that was just too far away. That wasn't a real thing. So the language thing kind of stuck a bit more. I think maybe that's why. And then in terms of Guarani, the first time I ever kind of read about it, not even heard about it, was my final year of my degree. And I did a degree with Open University. So it was like 6 years. And the final year of Spanish, I remember reading this article about Paraguay and about how there was this language there that was this really unusual case because it's this indigenous language, but it still lives alongside Spanish. It's not just been crushed. Well, debatable, but you know, it's still thrives, again, debatable, but it still exists and is quite strong. And I was like, oh, interesting. Didn't think much of it until then it came to writing my final dissertation for that course. And I thought, okay, what am I going to write about? What's the thing that interests me? And it was the languages that interested me and that I wanted to then kind of focus on. So I wrote about Spanish alongside other languages. So I wrote about Spanish in the US alongside English, right, in Catalonia alongside Catalan, and in Paraguay alongside Guarani. Wow. And so I then had this chance to kind of dig a little bit deeper, but still that was then, like, I knew about the US, I knew about Spain, you know, that was still the kind of outlier that I felt like I didn't know much about even then. So that was like 2015. And then 2017, me and my husband went, we went traveling, and we initially were going to go very much in the other direction. Mm-hmm. But I just finished all this learning Spanish and I thought, you know what, there's this whole continent over there. Let's go see what's happening. And so I thought, okay, maybe this is a good chance to learn another language that's kind of around. And the direction we ended up going was sort of north to south. And so Paraguay being relatively south, I thought Guarani, as opposed to like Quechua or Mayan or some, you know, a Mayan language, I should say, felt like the more sensible option, as I would have that a little bit longer to learn it. And that's how I ended up. And I'd kind of forgotten, like I'd remembered I did the bit on the essay, but then it wasn't until later that I suddenly remembered, like, oh yeah, I read about this. And then there was this, and there were these stages to get into that point of learning it. Wow. So it was an interesting start.
I love that story though. I mean, it's so cool that you sort of, you read around it and about it, and then when you actually went on a trip and you felt drawn to it, so you went there and you learned the language for a trip as well. I always find it a powerful thing when you've got a goal, you know you're going to be in the country, you know you're going to be there, and it's a powerful thing, isn't it? It's a pull.
Yeah, it is. And what's interesting as well with Guarani is that even though, you know, I knew that I was learning it and I knew that it would be useful, and it was, but I also knew that in reality, we were going to spend a lot of our time in Asunción, which is the capital. And there's very much this sort of imbalance, I guess you could say, of Spanish to Guarani and rural and urban. So Guarani being spoken more rurally, Spanish being spoken more urban populations. And then the if you try and find like the specifics of the data, it's really complicated, because it's like they'll say, oh, 90% of the population are bilingual, and you go, wow, Guarani's like doing so well for itself. Look at this shining example. The whole world should look, and you know, any indigenous language community should look upon what they're doing. And you think, okay, well, hang on, 90% of the population is bilingual. But what does that actually mean? And the reality of that, I think, if you really break down that statistic, then comes to, well, 90% of the population have probably one of those languages very strong. And then the other kind of a little bit weaker, but most of that figure, that 90%, probably speak what's called Jopara. So when you learn Guarani, first of all, Guarani is used as sorry, I'm getting sidetracked. I hope this is okay.
Fine. No, this is great. I'm just listening intently because I find it absolutely fascinating learning something new. So tell me.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'll keep going. So first of all, Guarani can be used as a kind of broader term, a bit like you might say English, and include British English, American English, Canadian English, but then also, you know, African AAVE, African American Vernacular English, Cockney, and like all of these different kind of angles, languages, dialects, varieties. Guarani gets used as that term as well sometimes. So you've got it spoken in parts of Bolivia, Argentina, parts of Brazil, all of these different languages that then are under the kind of Tupi Guarani language family, and then under the Guarani like overarching term. But mostly when I say Guarani, I mean Paraguayan Guarani. But then there's also Jopara. So
Right.
Jopara is what most people speak. Can you kind of guess?
I'm guessing it's
what that might.
Is it a mix?
Yeah,
Spanish.
it's a mix.
Guarani.
It's a mix. And if I look in my dictionary right now, and if I go to the Guarani side and look for Jopara, it's going to tell me. Hopefully, I can give you the Jopara. So this is what it says. Mezclado, mixto, mezcla, combinación, lengua guaraní con mezcla de español, and then as a verb to mezclar. It doesn't say the fun bit, but also Jopara is a word for like a stew that is like everything mixed up in the stew as well, which is quite fun. Yeah.
I love that. We have a word actually in Macedonian for stew, and it's one of my favorite words. It's manja.
Manja.
That's
nice and easy to remember.
Yeah, and you can have different types of manja as well. I guess it feels like it's a Turkish or from Turkish from Persian word because of the j sound. The j sounds often in Macedonian have this origin of Turkish and then either Arabic or Persian originally. But yeah, cool. That's the kind of thing it reminded me when you said stew, because that's the kind of thing it reminds me of when I think of everything getting mixed in. I like that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when you went there then, were you hearing this mixture of the two languages?
So in Asunción, not really hearing it a lot. I heard Guarani spoken. In fact, on the very first day, we went to the mall and we went to a Japanese restaurant, as you do when you arrive in Paraguay. And in this Japanese restaurant, the guy that served me, I said, thank you in Guarani. And he was like, oh. And then I took the tray back and I said, it was delicious food in Guarani. And, he was like, oh, yeah, that's great. And I was like, oh, I spoke Guarani. This is amazing. That was day one. Mm-hmm. I didn't really speak much outside of the classroom to anyone after that. I heard it one more time, I think, outside of the classroom and outside of that Japanese restaurant on a bus. So the bus driver speaking it to one passenger. But anyone else that got on the bus, they would speak in Spanish. Mm-hmm. And the way that my teacher described this to me is that Spanish is the language, you can think of it as like Spanish being the language of the head and Guarani being the language of the heart. And if someone is at either end of emotional extent with you, if they are like utterly in love with you, you've been on the first date, you kind of cross in that stage, and then you're switched from Spanish to Guarani. But equally, if you've really, really got under someone's skin and you're sworn at in Guarani, then you've done wrong.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's this real depth to it.
And you were saying that you were studying there, so you were studying actually in Paraguay as well.
Yeah, I had a week of language school lessons. There's I think just one school that teaches Guarani to foreigners in the whole country, and I went there.
Well, you have to tell us the name so we can at least write it as well.
Yes, IDIPAR, IDIPAR. Yeah.
IDIPAR. So we'll try and find a link and pop it in the description for anyone else interested in going to learn Guarani in Paraguay. Yeah. But I mean, it's really interesting when you sort of, at the beginning, when you said this idea of is it Avanier? And was the other one, let me think about it, it was the Spanish.
Yeah.
Macañé? No? Macañé?
Caray.
Carayñé.
That's it.
Is Spanish, Carayñé.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as you said, there's this idea of this sort of Señor's language, Caranye, and Avanye is the Guarani. And I guess the way you were describing it, it really fits in with this whole urban is this one language, and then the sort of the people speaking sort of in the campus or out in the sticks are speaking the Guarani, the Guarani. And I think that sort of the parallels are quite striking. Really
striking. And but then also there's moments of confusion with that. So especially I think from an outsider perspective. So a side that fits with that idea of it being this very striking kind of almost manipulative use of the language was that we were there, I don't know how many weeks before the election, but at the time there were lots of kind of posters on lampposts and billboard stuff for the election that was going to happen with lots of Guarani words on. So they would say like, I think it was like, we hear you, like, or we're listening to you or something. It's like ro hendu and stuff like this. And so just these odd words, these little phrases in Guarani and then in Spanish. But it felt, I think because it was political, it felt kind of almost like, and when you actually look, I don't think, and this is the thing, like if you said, oh, does the president speak Guarani? He would probably say, sí, because he probably speaks Jopara, maybe, I don't know. Okay. But there's this really interesting thing that then feels like, okay, that's trying to cater to a certain audience, to cater to this sense of being very Paraguayan, because on the other side of that strong division that you can see stemming from the names of the languages is this, whether you are indigenous or mestizo, there's this underlying pride and this emblem of being Paraguayan that comes with Guarani, that comes with knowing Guarani and Spanish, that comes with Jopara even, that is just embraced more than you've ever seen for any,
I like that.
than I've ever seen for any indigenous language anywhere.
I really like that. That's very, very nice to hear. That really is nice to hear. And so do people learn, whether it's Jopara or Guarani, do they learn those as subjects at school as well and all throughout Paraguay?
So there are some other languages in the country. There are some more indigenous languages, and there's some more like German, I think Mennonite German populations as well, like sort of foreign languages that have come into the country. But everyone has, if you speak Guarani and Spanish, you have the right to education in your mother tongue. And if you speak one of the other languages, you have the right to education in Spanish and in Guarani. So you could be taught, if you go to school and say, okay, we're a Guarani speaking family, I want my child to have education in Guarani, you have the right to do that. But this is what's so interesting about Guarani. In fact, there's just buts everywhere you go. Just like you feel like you get in it, and then it's like sidetrack, side road. So that you have that right, but there's a lot of debate as to the language used in the textbooks. First of all, Jopara, is it when you include one Spanish word in there, or is it when it's 50% Spanish, 50% Guarani? What's that ratio? There's no agreed mixing of what Jopara actually is. So you get language purists that say, well, they're not having education in Guarani, they're having education in Jopara. And then, of course, you can't control the classroom of other teachers speaking Guarani, Jopara, Spanish.
Oh, wow.
So it's very interesting.
Wow. That does add an extra dimension and level to the whole thing, doesn't it? Because I'm even struggling to think of another example like that where in the world. I don't even know if I can think of anything like that. Sounds very unique.
No. Yeah, it is. And because it's not even like Jopara is like a Creole language, or like some people would argue that it's a distinct third language. Some would say it's a dialect, but then if it's a dialect, is it a dialect of Guarani or is it a dialect of Spanish? Because if it's a dialect, surely it has to be a dialect of one of those, you know? And so there's this real, academically, there's this real kind of lack of agreement on how to describe Jopera. But then socially, there's this just, well, I speak it.
Wow.
You know?
I guess if all three of them exist in together, there is a very strange scenario, isn't there, where there's sort of, I imagine people will look down a bit on Jopera because that's what people tend to do when there's a mix of languages or creoles. But particularly because you've got the Spanish still existing and the Guarani still existing as sort of languages that are in use, and then you've got the one in between that's a mix. So it's going to have a struggle. And when you think of creoles, normally that's two groups merging together to create a creole that is then the thing that people speak, right? So, you know, a language I was studying last year this year was Kristang, and that's a creole of Malay and Portuguese, and was spoken by about 100 people, I think.
I met some of them.
Yeah, in Malaysia and Singapore. Yeah. And when I think, well, that obviously is a bit different because Portuguese isn't still spoken there. Okay, Malay is, but Portuguese isn't. And it does tend to be linguistically with the words very Portuguese in terms of the vocabulary that we learned. It felt very Portuguese in my brain. But I suppose when one or both of the other languages have gone away and you're just left with that, that's one scenario. But this Paraguayan experience sounds like a very different scenario.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Kristang because I just wrote an essay about Jopera. And one of the things was this idea of, so there's an academy of Guarani in Paraguay, the Academia de la Lengua Guarani, right? And they are there in theory to ensure that the Guarani language kind of thrives and has, like this that I showed you, this isn't like an official dictionary. This is just something that someone made because they like the language, right? So they've made now the first official Guarani dictionary, you know, and trying to give it that stability, I suppose. But then as part of that, there's these disagreements within the academy of people saying, well, it has to be pure versus, well, actually, you know, the Spanish word exists and it's used, let's just let that happen. And there's a similar situation on that side of things with Kristang. And I used Kristang as an example because I'd encountered that. I was like, this is like Kristang. But yeah, like the minute that you then try and sort of purify it, it creates this here. Well, these people that speak both of these languages are still communicating. So there's this space now, and Jopera is going to flourish there. These languages, Guarani and Spanish, they don't exist separately. So Jopera has to exist.
Yeah.
It's so, and like you say, I've struggled long and hard trying to think and trying to read about and trying to find a situation that is mirroring exactly how this is happening, but I just can't.
I've got to be honest, I've not heard anything quite like it in the same way. And if anybody listening to this has, please do write.
Please do.
Because it would be fascinating to know of an example where it's like this, because it's not with two languages. This is the thing, isn't it? It's the two languages and the two very different language groups with the one in the middle. That's the thing that's particularly weird. Because I mean, you get sort of things that sort of maybe you could argue in Scotland with Scots and with Scottish English that when they're mixed together and then children go to school and they're told, often chastised for speaking bad English, because they're mixing Scots with English, maybe that's, but you wouldn't notice it in the same way as with Guarani, I guess, and Spanish, because they're such linguistically diverse groups of languages. And whereas Scots and English are both Germanic languages. And so where dialect or language starts and ends is always up for debate, right? But I mean, and I do hear people who speak Scottish English use more Scots style grammar sometimes when they're speaking, or more Scots words. It's the only thing that's coming to my mind now as we speak. And I've been thinking, my little cogs have been working on my brain, thinking about things that I studied. Because this year's been a great year for learning these kinds of languages and learning more about them. Because so many courses have opened up, right?
Yeah.
And
suddenly going online and things like that. Yeah.
And you can access all these things. But you started Guarani before the whole COVID thing.
Yeah.
How did you start? I mean, how did you start learning it?
I mean, that's a good question, because it's an interesting one, because there is a Duolingo course for Guarani taught through Spanish.
Tell me what owl is in Guarani. Go on, what's owl in Guarani?
Oh.
How do you make the owl cry in Guarani?
Well, I don't know. The original, I think it's been updated recently, but the original version that I had to work with, because there wasn't much else, was actually very Jopera, and was very heavily criticized. Like, all the forum posts when it was announced were like, well, what's the point? It's just like having a Spanglish course, which in itself is just layered and like, okay, right. But you know, the course was very much criticized because it wasn't pure Guarani. And I think now it's been updated and there's more, you know, it's not like manzana, it's actually like the Guarani word for apple, that kind of thing. So I had that to work with, which, because it was a lot of Spanish, was relatively easy. And there were a couple of courses on Memrise. There were some PDFs on Live Lingua that were in English. So that was handy. And there was one tutor on italki at the time. And that's what I had to get me started.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know what, as you were saying that about Spanish and English as well, and you mentioned that in the same breath, I just thought of Gibraltar and Llanito. And I wonder what the situation is like there. So I was only there for one day when I went years and years and years ago. But I wonder if it's a similar thing, because Llanito is a bit like that, isn't it, between English and Spanish?
Right. Yeah, maybe that's a good example. And alongside Spanish as well. Yeah, you could compare. But
one thing I picked up on that you said there then was with it being sort of with more Spanish words when you were learning it's weird, isn't it? Because it makes it more accessible because you already know that language, right?
Yeah.
This is a similar feeling that people get with Welsh and with other languages, like the Celtic languages particularly, because you know everybody knows English, and so you can insert words that you don't know in English. And I suppose you can do that with Guarani and Spanish.
Exactly.
The words, and it makes it more accessible, right?
Yes, and because there is no set agreement on what Jopera is, you can learn like probably like 50 basic Guarani words, like mostly like the grammar kind of fragment bits, and then add in the Spanish vocabulary, like the core vocabulary, and you could speak in like the most basic Jopera in a week or so if you were really going for it, you know, and really going for some speedy learning. But then what would happen is you just gradually add in some more Guarani vocab. But the thing that's interesting is if you then wanted to learn like more of that Guarani vocab, that's when you then need like the dictionary or the book, because if you try and ask someone, if you have like a friend then and you say, oh, how do I say this? Oh, you say it like, you know, gatto, I don't know, for cat, right? Yeah, but what is it in in Guarani? And sometimes people would have to think, even my tutor sometimes would have to, you know, think, oh, it's this, yeah, because it's just the mix is what is used by so many people.
Yeah, one of my Welsh teachers actually had a similar thing where she said she grew up speaking Welsh, but in her family, they just used the word carrots instead of moron for carrots. And she didn't realize there was another Welsh word until she sort of went to school or university. And someone said, what are you talking about, carrots? Why do you say carrots in English? That's the Welsh word. But when you were speaking then actually about these adding words in, it reminds me a little bit of type of the way New Zealanders speak English, and they kind of litter their English. So litter, they embellish their English. In fact, litter, I think, has a slightly negative connotation, which I don't want to imply. They embellish their English with Maori terms, and they do this, I think, to show respect. It would be amazing to see that sort of actually go turbocharged and sort of grow out of there, because I think the more and more people who sort of add more and more and pepper their language with more, more Maori in New Zealand, how beautiful would that be? And maybe you get to this point as well where you have this kind of in between, and people can switch and move between all three. And at the moment it's still very English with just the odd Maori phrase or word. But I think it would be cool to see that happening.
It would. And I think that is, I mean, if like when I've tried to speak like on tandem or something, if I try and like look for kind of Paraguayans, and I'll say, hola, and I'll be typing in Spanish and saying, oh yeah, I speak Spanish, but I've been learning a bit of Guarani, and they'll go, oh, I don't speak Guarani. And most people will say to me like, oh, I don't speak Guarani, because they think Guarani is Guarani puro, like pure, and like, oh, I speak just Jopera, or and it, like, no, there's a value. So even though it's so curious, because there's still this respect and there's still this like embracing of the language, and also like the kind of cultural Guarani stuff that goes alongside that. There's still this personal feeling of, oh, but I'm not I'm not fluent, I'm not like a Guarani speaker, even though they know more than most.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's sort of knowing what you know and what's workable and how things work. And I think the more you can add in, the better. I think probably for people, it's an interesting thing. I mean, and I obviously made the idea of came up with this thought about Maori in English, and it might be completely offensive to some people to think of that. And I mean, and I get it. I'm not going to prescribe for any second that's what people should, just because I said it. I'm just thinking it would be cool to add more Maori into daily language. And the same, I imagine, for people who speak Guarani and they speak, something in between, that for them, they don't want to sort of do a disservice to Guarani and say, oh, I speak it when.
That's the thing. That's the thing. And so that's where I feel like, I know we didn't meet to talk about like Jopera rights, but that's why I feel there is this need for the acknowledgement of Jopera alongside as a valid way of speaking, and that people can still feel that pride and can still embrace that, but can say, oh, I don't speak Guarani, I speak Jopera, rather than just, oh, I only know a little, a few words, I speak Jopera. And when that term is still so open and undefined, that's so unusually empowering, I think, for language.
It is. Do you know, this really strikes a chord with me, because within my own family and my own sort of background as well, Welsh was lost, and you'd hear people on radio as well, and they'd be speaking Welsh, and they'll say things like, but I don't really speak very good Welsh. Well, your Welsh is perfectly fine, but they tend to say like phone numbers or certain things just in English. They'd say certain words in English, and it's obviously because of a long history. I mean, I won't go down that road of the history, but for indigenous peoples, this is a constant battle. I mean, this is there's the identity, there's the language, there's what's come out the other side, if anything's come out the other side, where there's something in between. And I think there's something quite nice by with what you're saying about having some sort of recognition for the people who are sort of caught between the devil and the deep blue sea.
That's it, because it is caught in the middle. I mean, I said 90% of the population in some claims speak both languages, and at the same time 10% of the population is indigenous, with the other 90% being mostly mestizo, and so like mixed. And it's like that then creates this really unusual linguistic and kind of ethnic balance there that is so curious. But yeah, there was something I was going to say and I've forgotten what it was. Related to what you said. I've forgotten.
No, but
It'll come back to me.
I love the idea of having sort of giving legitimacy to people who have got this sort of background and knowledge, and saying, do you know what, it's fine to embrace both sides. There's no shame in speaking something that represents all parts of you and your family and your history. Because like you say, people, look, we don't live in a vacuum. Things don't happen in a vacuum. Some things, when two different groups merge, there are facial features or skin color differences that are immediately obvious that there's what the sort of mix is. Some indigenous peoples, like the Welsh, the Irish, and the Scots, when they mix with the English, there wasn't that immediate, oh, you can tell that person's this or that person's that. You could say people have Irish eyes sometimes, or you know what I mean, or Welsh people typically had darker skin, years and years ago, but you can't really make that difference anymore. Whereas I think in a culture where you can, where you visually see some of the mixture of the family heritages, I think it can be possibly, the feelings can be more stark, and so giving legitimacy to that, I think, is actually quite a nice thing for those who want it and need it. At least have that as an option on the table.
Yeah. I've remembered what I was going to say. I was going to tell you a bit about the history of the language and kind of the country tied in. So we're holding it up as this like unusual example, like how did this happen? So if we go backwards, there's a lot of key features. So one important element is the Jesuits, so the missionaries that went out to that part of the world, and that like region of like kind of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay area. And it was either you are in with the Spanish colonists, probably not going to have a great life, maybe on the kind of Brazilian side, get sold into slavery, not much fun, or you go with the Jesuit missions and you have a little bit of a nicer life, even if you have to kind of follow their religion and their way of life. And what's really interesting about what they did is they wrote it down. So they wrote down Guarani for the first time, which then meant that down the line, there was this written record of the language, because then there was this war, the War of the Triple Alliance, where Paraguay actually went to war. Paraguay started the war, I think, as far as I remember, with Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay, because that's what's fun to do against your huge neighbors. So Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay versus Paraguay. The country was almost wiped off the map. They lost like crazy high percentage of their male population. And so the women were then the indigenous women that were left from the kind of Paraguayan landmass were then raising the children with Guarani. So there's this whole kind of these huge, big, important events in history that just shaped like these moments where it could have disappeared. It could have disappeared, the missions, but they wrote it down. It could have disappeared in this war, but they didn't win the war, I don't think, but that they managed to keep some land mass, and then there was a Chaco war, and so and then the mothers were there to then teach it to the children. And it's all these points in history where it's just gone, nope, not yet, no, still sticking around.
Wow, I love that I love that, and I love the parallel actually for the Celtic nations, because the Vikings did a similar thing. They came, invaded, took their wives, but they left their children with the wives or the people they've had children with. I don't know how. Obviously, it was a very murky past in Viking times, but because of that, they didn't sort of leave their language in the same way as, you know, people who sort of invade and they kill everyone, sort of, or make people speak the language, like sort of English speaking peoples have done that. They've known that language is power, and they deliberately decimated a linguistic population, and they've done it quite consciously and knowing that that's the key to dominating a nation, right? Whereas Vikings didn't do that in the same way. They were in the Celtic nations, and that's why sort of your Irishes and your Manx and these languages lived on, even though they've sort of, if they do the DNA test, they've got all this Scandinavian heritage, but the language is pretty much left intact because it was the mothers who were raising the new nation out of the sort of the war in the lands that were ravaged by the Vikings. They were sort of raising the children with the language, right? So the idea of a mother tongue is so
I was going to say something to be said for mother tongue. Yeah,
it's quite a powerful thing, and I think, you know, we've got women to thank really for that, for the survival of say Manx to when it survived, as you know, the first. So obviously a native speaker died in 72, but then we still had fluent speakers. But there are other languages that, you know, had we not had that situation with women keeping Manx, the situation today on the Isle of Man might be very different. There are other factors as well, obviously. It's a long thing, but I love that there are these parallels with Guarani and with other places in the world, and I love that there's something quite unique about Guarani too. You've taught me so much. I knew you would come on and tell me some fantastic facts. Have you got any books to show us about what people can buy to learn?
Oh, my books.
You've got a book in front of us before with the
I did my dictionary. So you asked earlier, what did I use to learn, right, in the beginning? Well, I couldn't get anything. I couldn't buy any books online. I couldn't find them. There was, I think, maybe one dictionary on Amazon. And I thought, if the one thing I'm going to have is a dictionary, I don't know what use that's going to be if I've got nothing else. So I didn't get that. But then when I went to Paraguay, I think it was actually on the last day of my time at the language school, and I'd been told by a taxi driver, I think, about this bookshop. So I went to have a look, and I found this huge selection, and I don't know why they're all blue. I don't know what's to be said for that, but so I was like, okay, I have to get some. So this dictionary is kind of very, I say well known, but like my tutor had this, and at the school they had a copy of this, but this is just a very Spanish to Guarani dictionary. Then this course, so there's this guy, I think there might be a picture of him. Oh no, there's no picture of him, but Felix de Guarania is a really famous, try and hold it so you can see, is a really famous like author, poet. He'll probably tell me all of his things, kind of a literary man and a bilingual writer. And he loved the Guarani language. Like, that was a real kind of passion. So this is the practical course of the Guarani language. How practical it is debatable. It's very much, here's a list of things. Here's some vocabulary. Learn this. But you and this is a key thing actually that I've learned from Guarani, that from learning Guarani, that I've taken beyond and has really, really helped. And that is how to just use anything to learn a language. Like, all I had at the beginning were those kind of 4 things: the tutor, the Duolingo, the memrise, which I finished like so quickly, and then the live lingua stuff that was kind of, some of it you just couldn't read, it was like printed, right? And you find ways, you have to become adaptable to what you have. You know, you can't just rely on the course kind of being very logical, and you know, it's very different.
This is a very common question, actually. How do you learn languages where there are not many materials? And it's exactly that, adaptability. You have to adapt.
You do. And you suddenly become so much more like this book, although I'm kind of saying, oh, it's not very practical, it's not very good. I've learned a lot from it because I've been able to be like, okay, there's this one word. I'm going to see this one word. I'm going to put it into a sentence. I'm going to rewrite that sentence multiple times. What happens if I add in that question thing that I've learned? And how do I put that in the future? You really then get creative with that. And that's a real skill from learning something like Guarani. There's this kids book, which I thought would be like a nice kind of, you can see actually on here where I've just written, I don't know how well you can see that.
Yeah, I can see you've written notes.
Yeah, all over it. This is go to sleep, da 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 da. Yeah. Torore shemembe mi ekente baguikatu. Like that. So you can hear the tune, which was quite fun doing that one. And then a more sort of advanced reader book that I got this one is like myths, and it's bilingual, Spanish Guarani. So like Chavuku, I think, is quite a famous myth, sort of folklore type character as well. And then the grammar book, which, when the less that you have as well, something else that's really interesting, I think, is you then suddenly become more aware of like, okay, so I'm reading this thing about grammar, but now how do I use that practically, rather than just reading it and expecting there to be an appropriate amount of exercises to then just guide you through. You've just got to be more proactive with it.
Yeah, exactly. You've got to sort of see it sort of placed on the language, right? Instead of just sort of a skeleton. You need the meat on it, on the bones, so to speak. One of the things that you showed us there with the parallel texts, I think that's interesting because we talked obviously about the sort of the social situation and how Guarani feels, and with Spanish and with Joppa in the middle. But one of the things you kind of hinted at there as well is there's this whole wealth of stories that people have passed down from generation to generation, and you all of a sudden get access to these things.
Yep. I think I may be wrong. Guarani is like it's like something like the fifth most the language that's most responsible for like scientific kind of nature terms. It's something like fifth. It's really high, weirdly high, because there's like just there's so much, right? I mean, I don't know if you've ever heard of is it called guarana? It's like a kind of caffeine fruit or something. You get it in some sort of energy drinks.
Oh yeah, guarana.
Yeah. And I think that's from that same kind of area. So yeah, a lot of plant words. Where we stayed in Asunción, there was a park nearby called Parque de la Salud, the health park, and you'd have to take your little ID to get in and go there in the mornings. And on the trees, they had all of the names of the trees kind of nailed on, hammered on, in Guarani. Right. All the different names of the trees, and you'd see, and like, okay, I can see that, the pattern, and I knew like this is something very different. I think, I think I've from what I've read about Quechua, I think this is quite similar in the sense that a lot of those early words are very nature oriented. So, you learn like, okay, well, that's the water and that is the wood and that's the this. And you can then spot these patterns and these elements throughout,
Yeah, we saw that when obviously we were looking at Cholula for the Polyglot Conference last year. And clearly 2020 wasn't the year for the Polyglot Conference in Cholula. We'll see what happens in 2021. But on my trip there to sort of meet and to sort of help see about organizing it, you see these names of particularly things to do with nature in the names of towns and places, and you do see them repeated again and again and again, and it is nice.
Yeah,
it is lovely. I mean, that honestly, thank you so much for joining me and for talking about your sort of adventure into Guarani and how you got on with it and your experiences and your insights. That I found it really interesting myself, and I hope that other people out there found it interesting too. Just share with us where people can find you, and we'll put some links there as well. And yeah, I'm sure people would want to reach out.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I have to recommend a couple of places if someone's watching and thinking, oh, I'm curious, I want to learn more. I'm definitely not I'm a advocate, I think would be the word for Guarani, but I'm not the person, you know. Guaranglish is a really useful app to know about, and Idipar we mentioned as well, and the Duolingo course is definitely worth as a starting point checking, and Closemaster have Guarani as well, so it's worth kind of investigating, especially with Guaranglish. They're so lovely. If you have questions, do reach out to them. But yeah, if you want to find out more about me and what I'm doing, Lindsay Does Languages is the place, lindsaydoeslanguages.com.
Fantastic. Well, we'll put all the links anyway in the description, so please do reach out, and thank you so much, and we will speak to you again.
Can I teach you how to say thank you?
You can.
Agouge.
Agouge.
Agouge. Yeah.
Agouge.